Now it's time for Global Insight, where we connect with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Japan's Fumio Kishida took office as Prime Minister on Monday, vowing to make efforts to lead the country out of the COVID-19 pandemic and tackle income inequality. After winning a leadership race within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party last week, a parliamentary vote confirmed him as the head of government. He named his key cabinet members and also called for a parliamentary election for October 31st, a much earlier date than many expected, although his party is, of course, more than likely to retain its majority in the decision-making body. Today, we discuss what's ahead for Japan's 100th Prime Minister as he sets out to lead the world's third largest economy, and also how he's going to shape the country's foreign policy amid various global and regional challenges. And for this, we welcome back Craig Mark, Professor of International Studies at Kyoritsu Women's University, and Alexis DUDDEN, Professor of History at the University of Connecticut. It's lovely to see you both. And well, we've got a lot of ground to cover here, so let's start with you, Professor Mark. Now, it's been a very interesting week, the past week we've had, and a very exciting weekend. Now, Mr. Kishida, he took office as Prime Minister on Monday, and his first agenda is going to be, of course, tackling COVID-19 and boosting the economy. But what's he going to do? What's going to be his first steps as Prime Minister?
Well, thanks for having me back. This Friday, he's going to give a policy speech to Parliament just before it dissolves next week. And in that speech, we're probably going to get more details about how he proposes to stimulate the economy to recover from the pandemic. In his first press conference as Prime Minister last night, he did mention a couple of details like increasing wages for public sector workers, like teachers and nurses. So he is going to push his direction of a new Japanese capitalism, a bit of a departure from Abenomics. So having a stimulus package and continuing to tackle the pandemic as vaccinations continue to roll out, that's going to be his first priority and his main pitch for winning the election, which is going to be at Halloween.
And now, Professor DUDDEN, let's talk about his win of the leadership race last week. It seemed like there was a 50-50 going on here with Taro Kono. What do you think really helped Mr. Kishida solidify his win against the more popular and admittedly more interesting Mr. Taro Kono?
Well, I think, with all due respect, Abe figured out how to come back into power, and so there were two people set up to divide the race. And if you look at that initial vote, Kishida won by one vote, and so the other Abe-backed candidates kind of divided and took away the votes from Kono Taro. Who is most interesting is difficult to tell. Obviously, Kono is more engaging. He's unusual. He speaks better English. At the same time, Kishida has a sort of similar study abroad track record. He was in second and third grade in New York City. So who knows what he'll do? What we do know is he's brought Abe Shinzo back into the fold.
And Professor Mark, Mr. Kishida, he started naming his cabinet members on Monday, and it looks like former Education Minister Hirokazu Matsuno, he's going to be Kishida's chief cabinet secretary, and the new Prime Minister, he looks like he's going to hang on to the many of the key incumbent members of the cabinet, such as the Justice and the Defence and Foreign Ministers. What do these candidates tell us about the kind of government that Kishida is going to be leading?
Well, the most striking thing is keeping the Defence and Foreign Minister the same. So that does show the influence of, you could say, the most powerful faction in the LDP, the Hosoda faction, which Mr. Abe is a member of. However, he does have most of the cabinet being brand new members, 13 out of the 20. And so Mr. Kishida is trying to blunt the criticism of opposition politicians, saying, oh, it's just an Abe cabinet and he's the shadow shogun pulling the strings. So he'll be using his authority of an election win to also try and make the point that it's his government, not Abe's government.
And well, as you both have mentioned, many have sensed former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe looming behind the scenes. And well, Professor Dudden, how much autonomy and authority do you think Kishida is going to have? Do you think he's going to be constrained by his faction, where Shinzo Abe does very much remain a very influential figure?
It's an excellent question, and I completely agree with Professor Mark. I think there are two ways to answer this question. One is to be broadly comparative and to look at what just happened in Germany, right? Where we had an election, Angela Merkel, and everything's up for grabs, and there are all kinds of new people involved. In Japan, we've had a turnover, and on the one hand, yes, as Professor Mark has just mentioned, Kishida is putting new names in. At the same time, more than the faction is the lobby group behind this, the Nippon Kaigi, the Japan Conference. And here I would have people pay attention to the new Chief Cabinet Secretary Matsuno. He is not a new figure. He is somebody very hardline. And I think a lot will depend on how he articulates policies for this administration. So personally, I'm not expecting a huge departure from the past. I agree that there's going to be a focus on domestic income doubling plans, to quote something from 1950s. But I think we're really looking at a new way of defining Japan first in the region.
And indeed, Professor Mark, during his bid for LDP leadership last week, Kishida spoke about increasing middle-class incomes and also reducing wealth disparity. But all this time, he's been seen as more of a stable figure than a reformer. Do you think that's going to be enough, though? Is it going to be enough to play it safe when tackling the country's structural problems?
Yeah, well, we'll have to see if the rhetoric of a new Japanese capitalism and redistributing income actually comes to pass. Particularly, how can he encourage the larger corporation to lift wages, and how can he convince them to push more people onto permanent contracts rather than the higher number of people on unstable employment? So that's going to be a big challenge. And also, can he stimulate the regions, particularly rural areas with declining populations? It's interesting, someone who's returned to the cabinet is Seiko Noda. He's one of his female opponents in the leadership race. She's been given the job of a revitalization minister and addressing gender inequality and population decline. So he's got big challenges to fix the structural challenges of the Japanese economy, and particularly as the pandemic ends and as borders open up, we need to see the extent to whether foreign workers return to help boost the labour force, and foreign tourists return in large numbers, international students. So we'll have to wait and see how the actual policies roll out after the election, assuming he wins government.
So many domestic challenges that Mr. Kishida faces, but also there are questions around his foreign policy as well. Professor Dudden, the incumbent defence and foreign ministers, they're set to retain their positions in the Kishida administration. What do you think this is going to mean for the country's foreign policy, primarily in regards to its role in Quad and also its position on China?
Well, interestingly, Defense Minister Kishi in recent weeks has been going out of his way to make a lot of statements about Japan's position on Taiwan. And I think that's going to be the first test. I mean, as your news report has made clear, Beijing, to celebrate its National Day over the weekend, had a lot of air incursions in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And so really how the Kishida administration responds for Japan, but also a Japan that is repositioning itself in the Quad, and also this new construct of AUKUS, with an Australia, British, American maritime force. So I think Japan is for a historian to say a country is at a crossroads, it's kind of a cop-out. I think the test that Abe had wanted for his own administration involving the constitutional amendments he saw may come into the fore for Kishida. And here we really will be looking at Taiwan, maybe most of all.
And Professor Dudden, of course, the ruling LDP, they're no Koreophiles by any means, but Kishida, he was considered a more dovish candidate than his contenders during the race when it comes to East Asia relations. In fact, Beijing media has openly shown preference for Fumio Kishida. Do you think he would show more interest in regional cooperation than his predecessors, Yoshihide Suga and Shinzo Abe?
So it's a really tricky question, to be honest, because if you look at the parliamentarian leagues, the friendship groups between South Korea and Japan, the LDP actually does have quite deep ties with many South Korean politicians. At the same time, when the so-called history disputes come to the fore, when history is weaponized and turned into a security threat, then kind of all bets are off. And here's the problem, because both Kishida, but more to the point, other members of the cabinet are very clear. They deny the existence of historical atrocities committed during Japan's occupation of Korea, wartime colonial histories. And so we'll have to see what happens. Kishida has said, everything is settled with South Korea, forced labor, slave labor, the history of sexual enslavement. And this very much also pertains, again, back to Chief Cabinet Secretary Matsuno, who has even denied the existence of the history of the enslavement of Korean women under the Japanese occupation. So we're really going to have to see what unfolds. And this also pertains to histories not limited to Korea, but also the Nanjing massacre. Some members of the new cabinet in print have denied the history of the Nanjing massacre. So we'll really have to see how this plays out regionally.
And Professor Mark, what are your views on this? I mean, with the current foreign minister likely to stay on where he is, what does that mean for Kishida's foreign policy towards countries like South Korea and China?
It was reported on the Japanese media that last night that President Moon Jae-in and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin sent congratulatory messages to Mr. Kishida and are hoping that they can have stable relations, which is nice of them to do. But I think the big challenges are going to be in foreign policy. Can any stable relations be restored? For South Korea, really, I think the Kishida government is going to wait until next year, until the presidential elections, when they hope a more conservative administration will replace Mr. Moon to maybe have some more progress there. As for China, they are going to continue to push the Quad and support Taiwan, as Professor Dudden referred to, and also AUKUS. Japan has welcomed the AUKUS agreement, and defence cooperation with the UK is increasing as well. So who knows, AUKUS could become JAUKUS under the Kishida government. The overall direction of foreign policy will still strongly support the US alliance and still be confronting China. So the balance of maintaining relations with China as its closest trading partner is going to be probably the biggest challenge for the Kishida government in foreign policy.
Well, Professor Dudden, while bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo broke down in 2019 with Tokyo taking steps to hurt South Korea's semiconductor industry, Seoul did retaliate initially, but it later reached out to Tokyo for dialogue a number of times at various occasions where their heads of government or their foreign ministers were at the same place. Why do you think Japan has been so evasive so far? And Do you think there's enough common ground right now for the two countries to come together?
There is enough common ground. There's always sufficient common ground. Why is this so difficult? Is because the idea of Korea, that is to say, the word Korea in Japan, is politically very important, and it carries a lot of weight for political purposes. And so being evasive, not having a real policy, it's in American politics, it's like throwing the term immigration around. And I don't mean to sound strange, but it's a word rather than a place or a people for Japanese politicians to shore up their own support base. And so it's very difficult to make policy when you're using it for political purposes. At the same time, of course, there are deep ties, economic ties, social ties, family ties, historical ties. And especially now, the time is right for Korea and Japan to be able to work together. As Professor Mark mentioned, President Moon Jae-in has reached out saying he's eager to work with the Kishida administration. So it's actually, the ball is in Tokyo's court.
But then, well, you said the ball is in Tokyo's court, but Professor DUDDEN, Kishida has recently spoken about the 2015 bilateral comfort women deal that he helped draw up, and he said that the ball is in South Korea's court. What do you think is going to be his approach to historical issues, and what steps do you think should be taken between the two sides in order to improve their bilateral relations?
Well, unfortunately, Kishida and many members of his cabinet have a view of history that doesn't necessarily involve evidence. So if we're going to use history for political gain, then I'm not really optimistic. If, however, Kishida is interested in creating a regional détente, then for him to lead what many Japanese believe would be beneficial to the region and listen to survivors of this history, to go with a more humanitarian understanding of the 20th century. Because honestly, and I guess this is all I'll say, this is not an issue between Japan and Korea. This is an issue of world history, and it is in Japan's benefit to lead the region on this issue, and it could be up to Kishida to win.
And now, before we go, Professor Mark, Mr. Kishida's party, they're going to be launching their parliamentary election campaign in the coming weeks, as the new Prime Minister did call a very much more earlier than anticipated election. So what is this process going to look like, and why do you think he called it so early? I mean, is the timing going to favour his party?
Yes, it does benefit the LDP. He said that, well, he wants to get the mandate of the people and get to work as fast as possible, but really it puts the opposition parties at a disadvantage. The campaign is going to officially start on October the 19th after the Diet is dissolved next week on Thursday. And so it's going to be a short campaign of less than 2 weeks, which gives the opposition less time to organise and mobilise and campaign. And so the LDP is very likely to keep its majority. It might lose a number of seats, but it's pretty much guaranteed that Mr. Kishida and his coalition with the Komeito party will be comfortably returned. It'll be interesting to see, though, next year. The upper house elections are due in the middle of next year for half the House of Councillors. And if things don't work out so well and he loses his majority in the upper house, it's much more narrow, then that could give him bigger problems in the year to come.
Well, that's all we have time for today. That was Craig Mark, Professor of International Studies at Kyoritsu Women's University, and Alexis DUDDEN, Professor of History at the University of Connecticut. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.